Hi, David.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm just back from a week in Europe, so, back in Brooklyn where I live. So, not the happiest I've ever been. But generally well. How about yourself?
Can't complain. Before I ask you exactly why you're not the happiest you've ever been, let me introduce us. This is The Wright Show. I'm Robert Wright. The Wright Show is available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're David Klion. You are, among other things, a BernieBro. You also write. You write for The Nation, and you are the news editor for Jewish Currents.
Yeah, and I write for a lot of places, The New Republic and Foreign Policy, N+1, Mother Jones, etc. Lots of places. Yeah.
Nothing if not prolific, including on Twitter, which brings us to the reason that I mentioned the BernieBro thing. One thing we're going to talk about is the alleged BernieBro problem. You are an alleged part of the alleged problem. In fact, you were actually featured in a Mike Bloomberg ad, or a tweet of yours was.
Two Mike Bloomberg ads, in fact.
Same tweet?
Same tweet a few days apart in two Mike Bloomberg ads.
As being illustrative of, how horrible Bernie supporters are. That was the text or subtext of the Bloomberg ad. So you've,
yeah, they blurred, these were ads where they went through a series of, horrifying tweets from Bernie supporters, or supposed Bernie supporters. And they blurred the names and the images, but it was definitely my tweet. They highlighted one bit of it and lingered on it a little longer. And you could tell if you know my avatar, which is a Tom Tomorrow cartoon of myself with, a kind of rainbow colored background. You could very easily recognize it.
Well, I would say the tweet itself, your tweets are inimitable. The tweet itself, to those of us who know you, suggested the authorship. So
can I just say here as an early defense
of you. Wait, before you say that,
yeah.
let me tell people that we will also be talking about contemporary politics, other aspects of the presidential race, and maybe some foreign policy stuff you've written, and some left foreign policy stuff, and some Bernie and Elizabeth Warren foreign policy stuff. All this is to come, but we are going to focus on this BernieBro issue. Now, what were you going to interject?
I was going to say that I have a distinct memory of, so longtime Bloggingheads heads may recall that I worked for Bob for, I think back in, 2012, 2013, thereabouts. I was an editor for Bloggingheads and for a period there, a frequent host, usually on foreign policy topics. And I have a distinct memory when I left Bob for my next media job from there, and told him that was going to happen on the phone. He actually chastised me for my, tweeting behavior, which at the time,
by the way, you could just use the second person, as if you're speaking to me.
That's true. I'm sorry. I'm so used to going on.
Not to chastise you again, but what did I chastise you for the first time?
Just I'm sure similar stuff, being intemperate, and this was probably before I was a BernieBro, but maybe I was just rude to some people or overcritical of some people in media, or loud about. Sometimes I'm sure stuff we agreed with. I'd be attacking Israel bombing Gaza or something like that. But I remember you saying that, that's not the best way to engage. And, clearly I didn't listen. What's funny is that at the time I had probably a few hundred followers. Now I have over 60,000, which honestly, when you get to that level, it starts to get like anything you say can potentially set off reactions from one or more factions. So it gets a little frightening.
But let's talk about how you got to 60,000. I mean, it seems to me, I do want to do take a microscopic look at this now infamous tweet, but, it seems to me, one reason, this kind of concerns me, the tone of some of your tweets, is it transcends the BernieBro issue. I do think these things can hurt Bernie. One indicator of that is when his opponents start using them in their ads, but there's a larger problem just having to do with the whole polarization things and in America. And the basic dynamic is the way to gain stature within your tribe is to say things often hyperbolic, extreme, whatever, that antagonize the other tribe. So there's an incentive for people to tweet in extreme ways, and I think you'd agree this tweet wasn't a massive aberration. I mean, you're known for intense tweeting, and it works. It does build a following. My question is it good either for the cause you're serving or the world? I mean, I think,
it's interesting you don't ask whether it's good for me, because that's the main concern.
No, clearly it's good for you, David. Your stature has grown. Because
it's more complicated than that, because I was about to say, like, the concern that a lot of people in my life have is whether it's good for me, whether I'm going to get myself, as we say, canceled, first of all, for one or another of these things. And also, whether the kind of, addictive cycle that of tweeting and getting responses and scanning the responses and following up, that, or the weird conceit that can get in your head when you do have a large following, that you're like a really important and influential person, which can be insufferable so, it has been good for me in some ways. It's given me a lot of opportunities and connected me to a lot of really great people. It's also sometimes miserable and clearly unhealthy.
I mean, most of my complaints about this kind of style of tweeting have been in a different context. It's been, and this is something I don't think you do much of, if any, I'm not sure, but it has to do with the resistance, kind of the voice of the resistance. I mean, I think, people who either misrepresent things Trump says or evince a kind of contempt for his followers, I think are disserving the resistance and actually ultimately helping his cause, to the extent that these kinds of things come to the attention of his followers, because they just feed into his whole narrative and, about the lying media and the contempt of coastal elites for everyday Americans and so on. So, so that's actually the reason this is a hobby horse of mine originally, but I think all parallel issues arise with Bernie, right? Does this hurt Bernie? And as for you, I'm sorry, I don't, wake up very often worrying about you or your career. No, I really apologize for that.
Well, it's just more my mental health, but that's fine. You don't need to.
But the funny thing is, the tweets get, and I'm sure this is misleading, but they almost give the sense of someone whose mental health is not in danger. I mean, if you keep tweeting like this, I was going to ask you about that, actually. I mean, do you, like, when you get blowback, and maybe we should analyze the tweet in question before we get into the kind of ancillary psychological questions, but
yeah, I think we should start.
Okay, so here's the tweet. Here's the tweet.
This is read it. Give a dramatic reading.
I will. I'll do my best.
Yeah.
My best David Klion imitation. So this was sometime after Bloomberg, who had joined the race, and the tweet is: libs, that is liberals who are flirting with Bloomberg now should be aware that they are going on lists. Next time they pretend to care about racism or sexual harassment or really anything other than money and power, we will remember what they were doing right now, and we will remind everybody. No, we will remind everyone, is what you said. So
I just want to say, anyone who's only listening to the podcast version of this is missing some terrific,
you missed some really tremendous gesticulation on my part.
Yeah.
I'm a veteran gesticulator. So now I think we know each other well enough that I can put the question this way without fear of offending you. Do you have any idea how much of an asshole you sound like in this tweet?
Yes. Well, for one thing, I've been told by many, many people. Yes, I certainly do have an idea. So I'll talk about this tweet because unlike some tweets of mine that have set off firestorms, I actually feel okay about this one with a few weeks hindsight. Clearly
I have some work to do today, David.
Clearly. No, I mean, first of all, I think that tweet has been widely and in many cases willfully misread, and I've heard that from many people, many reputable people you respect, Bob. I won't name any, but trust. Afterwards I'll name some, but I don't want to get them in trouble on this. totally understood what I was saying and felt that it was read in bad faith, which does speak to your frequent point about tribalism, that, people see things differently depending on what side they're on. But I think one way that it was commonly misread, and I saw this from people like David Frum or Julia Yaffe, people in that general kind of centrist or more neoconservative camp, they basically said they accused me of being kind of Stalinist or of having a kind of, I sounded like I was going to send people to the gulag and I was going to do a purge or that I was attacking thousands of regular people. Now I understand that a fiery tweet I think I wrote at 1 a.m. coming back from a bar, which tells you something, is maybe not it's open to all kinds of uncharitable interpretations, and I get that. But that said, first of all, I never said I was making lists, and as I've said many times since, I never did make a list. Although I know that some people subsequently did.
Well,
but I see
it
how
sounds
one
like
might...
you are, but it sounds like you're like chairman of the list makers or something. I mean, that's
Sure.
one question. Who the hell are you to say, if it's not your list, who are you speaking for?
So that's a fair question. And I'm, in many ways the lists are metaphorical. I mean, I know that some people have in fact gone ahead and made them literal, but what I was really saying there, I think is a much more defensible, if less flowery, statement, and one that's much more in line with how mainstream politics works. And some of the people calling it out, I think, were very hypocritical for doing so, given who they support or who they are in some cases. So what I was really calling for is something you've called for many times, Bob, in the context of the Iraq War, for instance, which is basic accountability. It's like, when you say something and when you do something, when you
that's when you advocate a policy that clearly doesn't work out. Yes, there should be accountability. That's a somewhat different matter from.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, I think that, when you back a candidate, you back their policy platform, but you also back, certainly what they were running on at the time, whatever they might go on to do. But you also, I think, back the institutions and forces that candidate represents, which in the case of Bloomberg are some pretty egregious ones. So, I mean, I don't want this point to completely dominate our discussion, or, let's just stipulate that this is how I and how a lot of people on the left feel. But, there is I think, totally defensible, proposition, whether, I don't know if you personally agree with it or not, that for one of the wealthiest people in the world to kind of parachute into a race and use his money in totally unprecedented ways to buy off large swaths of the political class, which fortunately so far doesn't seem to be working out for him in terms of getting votes. But nonetheless, when you see which political operatives and which pundits and so on are willing to basically forsake all of their principles for the sake of a quick payday, if you're just like working in very basic, campaign stuff for Bloomberg, you can make maybe 3 times what you can make for another candidate. And that's just for the most basic stuff. Who knows what top level operatives are getting? That creates a distorting effect on, our entire political process that I think is egregious. I also think Bloomberg is an egregious person with some egregious policies on his record. But mostly, the plain English sane translation of what I was spouting off at 1 a.m. is, I think if you work in democratic politics and you are willing to sell out to this, unprecedented level of money in politics and forego your principles on things like stop and frisk or Bloomberg's well-documented, history of sexual harassment, NDAs and so on, then you should be remembered by people who follow politics for doing that. They should remember that that's a choice you made.
Okay.
And that's all I was saying.
Let me say a couple of things before I challenge your claim that that's all you were saying, at least to some extent. So first of all, on the Iraq War issue, I mean, I've never said let's make lists, but it's true that I think it shouldn't be the case that if you look around at the main foreign policy think tanks, and, most of the people you see are people who advocated going to war with Iraq. And for that matter, you look at, some of our most important journalistic institutions, and they are, run by people who in some cases not only, advocated the invasion in a heartfelt way, but did flawed reporting that helped us get into the war.
I can't imagine what major American magazine you might be referring to.
I have no idea myself. So I guess we're both kind of puzzled. But let's move on. But I will say, I think the lists, what it triggered in my mind was the Hollywood blacklists. And here
Right.
I would say, in your defense, kind of in your defense, the analogy is not precise. I mean, what's most outrageous about the Hollywood blacklists is that, what is ostensibly an ideologically kind of neutral zone, it's just entertainment, would create as a filtering device, something ideological. I mean, not that doesn't happen by virtue of the very workings of the establishment, right? But in this case, it was very explicit. People of a particular ideology are never going to work again, and that was,
and not just in entertainment, but across any number in government and anything. I mean, their lives were destroyed in many cases, and these were people. First of all, we'll get into this in more detail, but I, as you'll often see on Twitter, reject equivalences between left and right. So in my mind, like, there is a difference between doing this to people advocating for the left and people on the right. I understand not everyone's going to see it that way.
No, of course not. I mean, that's, let's pause on that, because that's so fundamental. I mean, like, what do you mean by that? I mean, I understand if what you're saying here is, the way these things work. If you come out full-throatedly for Bloomberg, chances are that next time Jacobin's looking for somebody to write a piece, you're not going to spring to mind. I mean, that's just a reality.
Well, or to be a little more concrete, I mean, I think that the next time, and maybe it'll be Bernie or maybe it'll be AOC down the line or whatever it is. I mean, one reason I reject the false equivalence is because the left is not exactly used to having any power in this country. And the only reason this scares people is because there's the slightest glimmer that the left might have power for the first time in anyone's memory, and in the U.S. And I think that, I don't expect that Bernie Sanders is going to be hiring a lot of people who worked for Bloomberg. I don't think he should, which actually brings me to one more point that I want to make in my own defense, the hypocrisy point of the people attacking me. These lists, whether they're explicitly spelled out or not, are incredibly normal in politics across all establishment politics, in Democratic side, Republican side, centrist, liberals, whatever it is. Two examples that got brought up a lot, that I'll bring up here are, one is that it's been reported many times in mainstream outlets that Hillary Clinton keeps enemies lists. And these aren't just enemies lists of Rush Limbaugh or people like that who've attacked her. What they really are, like, if you were a Democratic senator and you endorsed Obama over Hillary in 2008, you went on one of her lists. And I think Claire McCaskill did this. And then it took years of basically groveling before the Clintons to get off.
Do you think that's a good thing? Do you applaud her for that?
No, but mostly because I don't like Hillary Clinton and
see, that's
Bill
what
Clinton,
I mean, David. This is just not.
But I'm just saying that
doesn't seem to me that you're managing.
Normal. I think that's normal. Also, the only principle there was loyalty to her personally. It wasn't any larger principle. So I don't really like that either.
But I guess
for instance, let me clarify. Let's say Bernie wins. I hope that if Bernie wins, he would staff up his White House with a large number of people who worked for, in particular, Elizabeth Warren's campaign, but probably some other campaigns as well. And I don't think that someone having chosen to work for Warren instead of Bernie Sanders, or to have endorsed Warren instead of Bernie Sanders, is the sort of thing that should get you put on a list as far as Bernie's administration.
But somebody else might disagree with you, and what kind of bothers me is I really think that you think that people who disagree with you along these dimensions are just bad people.
No, it depends what they disagree with me on and how strenuously they disagree.
Right, but beyond a certain point, I mean, I guess we all have a point. We all,
Bob, I know that although some of them you probably still talk to or consider friends or have on the show, I know that there are people we won't name who played a major role in selling the Iraq War, for instance, who you basically consider beyond the pale. Well,
ideologically, yes, but I don't think I think they're objectively wrong, but I don't think they're bad people. I think a bedrock article of faith of mine is that almost all people manage to convince themselves they're doing good. And moreover, they're led to their perspectives by intelligible, in principle, causal forces such that if I had been born in their shoes with their genes, I'd probably be them. Okay.
Well, it's funny because when we talk about, U.S. foreign policy in particular, it often is people who grew up very similar to me, in a variety of ways.
But not with your genes and not with your environment. I mean, one of the...
No, like really close. I mean,
but it's psychologists have learned that even among siblings who grow up in the same household, there's important influence lies in something called non-shared environment. Just for example, it's like you may have an older brother, but he doesn't have one. That matters. He has different friends at school, blah, 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 blah. These things, we don't need to get into determinism.
I understand what you're saying, and I accept what you're saying. I don't doubt we could get really philosophical in a field here, which I know you probably also like to do sometimes, but I don't doubt I don't doubt that most people, for instance, most of the intellectuals who backed the Iraq War, think of themselves as good people and probably are in their personal lives good people. And some of them, I think, from what I know or from what I've encountered are pleasant people to be around. Some of them are not at all. We don't need to name any names, but and obviously the same goes for people who agree with me that some of them are awful and some of them are very nice, and there's a whole range. I do believe some people are truly terrible, and I'm not going to rattle off examples either, although I will say that I think the Trump administration is particularly prone to attracting such types. Some people, I think, just need to be driven from the public sphere. I probably have a more expansive idea of who those people might be. I'm sure I do than you do. But also, I only have so much power to drive anyone from the public sphere. I mean, we can all express our opprobrium. We can insult people. We can trade insults, whatever. But it's at the end of the day, most of that is abstract. We probably should at some point get into, having worked at Bloggingheads and had a responsibility when I worked at Bloggingheads to try to set up good faith discussions between people who disagree. I have some feedback, actually. I feel like let me start positively.
Okay, but first, wait. Before you do that, I want to stick for a second on the.
Are you censoring me now?
Should we run out of time? That will be such a shame. But let me first spend some more time, because this very issue of I want to revisit a specific part of this tweet in the context of the question of whether you are kind of Manichaean and convince yourself that people who disagree with you about matters of political consequence are just bad people, or kind of read into their motivations bad motivations that may not be warranted. Now let's read this again. You say about liberals who are flirting with Bloomberg, you say, next time they pretend to care about racism or sexual harassment, or really anything other than money and power, we will remember what they were doing right now. And we remind everyone. So you really believe that you can infer from the fact that any liberal in the world who supports Bloomberg, you can infer from their support of Bloomberg that they don't care a bit about racism or sexual harassment, and in fact, all they care about is money and power. That's really a valid inference? You can't imagine somebody who just wants to beat Trump at all costs and thinks Bloomberg's the guy who will do it, notwithstanding his imperfections?
Well, so I think another distinction, which the tweet doesn't explicitly draw and which I clarified in follow-ups, is I'm really not talking about any random person who is tempted to vote for Bloomberg. And I've met such people.
No, you're talking about liberals who are flirting with Bloomberg.
Yeah, but I should have been in the tweet, and I subsequently clarified, and I will clarify on here, more specific. I'm talking about insiders. I'm talking about political officials. I'm talking about pundits who write for or
even there, can't you imagine?
And I'm talking about political strategists and consultants who take money for their services. I'm not talking about random voters.
But can't you imagine more benign motivation than you're attributing to them? There are people who, It's not that easy for me to think of people I wouldn't vote for over Trump. And if I were convinced that they alone in the Democratic Party can do it, or they are way better positioned to do it than others in the Democratic Party, I can imagine choosing them instead of the person I prefer ideologically. It wouldn't mean I embrace everything about them. And I got to admit, for me, Bloomberg would be the most severe test in the entire field.
Well, I'm glad we agree on that.
But still, you see,
so in fact, I'll draw, as we go into a very exciting Super Tuesday, which we're recording this on, and we don't know what the results will be yet. But let's record for posterity where things are right now, and then I'll get back to Bloomberg. A few days ago, it looked like Bernie Sanders was very likely to be the plurality winner of votes and delegates nationwide. If you looked at betting markets, at Nate Silver, at most mainstream political analysis, everyone was kind of coming around to that view and panicking because mainstream analysts tend not to like Bernie or his movement. And people who were more like me were obviously very excited. Then Biden, I think people expected him to win South Carolina, but he won it by a bigger than expected margin. And that got a lot of good press out of that. And then literally just in the last, 48 hours, Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg have both dropped out and endorsed Biden, and Beto O'Rourke has also endorsed Biden. And from reporting, it seems pretty clear that while Obama probably isn't going to publicly step out and do this, he has kind of signaled within Democratic circles that this is the way things need to go. And so, on the old poli-sci phrase, the party decides, the party seems to have abruptly decided for Biden. And if you look at, the betting markets and the 538 forecast and so on now, you can see Biden surging at an almost unprecedented rate at Bernie's expense. So that's the state of play right now. And it looks like states could break down in any number of ways between those two candidates. Maybe Warren, who's been trailing badly behind actually Klobuchar and Buttigieg, could get a boost from them leaving. That's where things are now. I'm going to hold off from making predictions.
I think what we could say, we should emphasize, it's almost 5:00 on Super Tuesday. We don't know anything for sure. It seems safe to say that the two leaders in the delegate count at the end of today will be Bernie and Biden.
Yeah, I feel very confident that will be true.
And that's what we can assume going forward. And that Bernie will still have a chance, even though, again, he is now the betting markets, last time I checked, had Biden with appreciably over a 50% chance, Bernie around 30-35. But let's assume.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, look, Biden, there will be debates, and he's one major senior moment away from trouble.
100%. I think, look, I'm for all I'm a known and dyed-in-the-wool BernieBro. I try to be pretty empirical and fair-minded. One reason I've believed in Bernie for the last 5 years, basically, is that last time around, I think I did in 2016. I saw him as more of a very necessary protest candidate against the Clintons and the establishment. This time around, but I expected her to win the nomination, and I did, as I've said a million times, vote for her in the general. This time around, though, and I've felt this way, for the past few years now, I've really thought Bernie had a path, and I still think Bernie has a path. And I have watched, in this case, I think the mainstream view has come around to where people like me are. Not happily, but I think
you mean that he actually has a good chance of beating Trump?
Well, sure, but first of getting the nomination. Oh. I think that
path to the nomination. Well, that was conventional wisdom until the South Carolina primary, yeah.
No, but it only started being conventional wisdom maybe 2 or 3 months ago. Yeah. I've believed that for a long time. So, that's just to say that, if people like me, I think, there is a strain of Bernie supporter online. We said I have a reputation as a BernieBro online, but the truth is, to the extent I can assess my own reputation, I actually think that in the grand spectrum of Twitter wars, I'm seen as a relatively moderate Bernie supporter, not least by Bernie, the hardcore supporters themselves. For instance, I have not been tweeting snakes at Elizabeth Warren, and in fact have been defending her character and good name and saying things like, my friend Sam Adler-Bell also has said and written for The Intercept and other places that, if Warren were doing better than Bernie, I might well be supporting her right now. But the reality is he has built a broader base than her and a more diverse base and a more working class. And she has not really broken out of, I tweeted just today that, cause there was this New York Times article by Shane Goldbacher about her, her sort of not getting beyond the professional kind of Whole Foods NPR demographic. And I said that, in my world, in, kind of gentrifying Brooklyn and in the northwest suburbs of DC, where I grew up, in my world, almost everyone I know supports, either Warren or Sanders. But in the real world, if you look at the polls, Sanders has way, way more support than her. So it's the Warren supporters who live in a bubble. And I say this with love to the many Warren supporters in my life. But Sanders has built something. And I think he's built I agree with the Nation's endorsement from a few days ago, which was not guaranteed. I know they were considering Warren for a long time too, and there were internal debates. But in the end, they endorsed not only Sanders, but Sanders and his movement. And, this is, I think I'm heavily paraphrasing here, but this is the best chance in any of our lifetimes to elect someone who is genuinely, unapologetically on the left and has like an actual shot. Now, I know some people disagree he has an actual shot against Trump, which is kind of a separate debate, but the polls show he does. And the polls have been pretty accurate about everything else. They certainly show he has a better chance than Warren or than most of the people who've dropped out. Between him and Biden, it's more debatable.
I think the skepticism is about how much these kinds of polls tell you at this point. I personally think he's better positioned to beat Trump than a lot of people think. I do think if there's a single thing that's a poison pill, and he could neutralize this if he shifted his position not that dramatically, but I think the poison is the attack ad that says, accurately at this point, he will take away the private health insurance that you're comfortable with and that your employer provides, and force you to trade it for an untested government program. I just think that's a killer. And if he even said, it could arrange for some journalist to ask him, would you be totally against allowing what people do with Medicare now, which is buy supplementary insurance if they're not happy with the coverage? And if he just said, sure, that would demonstrate, first of all, it would partly redress people's concerns on that issue, but it would also demonstrate a little bit of pragmatic flexibility that I think people assume he doesn't have and would help in other areas as well. But anyway, Well,
here's where I make a mandatory disclaimer that I don't speak for the Bernie campaign, have never taken talking points directly from the campaign. I'm not one of those like surrogates disguised as a journalist. I am an independent journalist whose work I like to think, can be judged on its own merits. And I am openly pro Bernie because I believe journalists, or at least some journalists, I believe, should be open about their biases and preferences, and that it makes us more and not less trustworthy, which is a whole other debate too. But suffice to say, I'm not speaking for the Bernie campaign here, and anything I might say about his position on insurance, in no way reflects.
Disclaimer registered.
It doesn't reflect any inside knowledge either about what they might be thinking. What I do know, because anyone who follows and analyzes politics knows this, is Bernie's not going to pass Medicare for all. Certainly not in his first years in office.
Said, right. Yeah.
He's not. So the way I look at Medicare for all, and I understand some Bernie people really do believe,
but that doesn't help with that attack ad, by the way.
No, it doesn't. And I look, if that attack ad gets made hypothetically, and it probably will, then I suspect the campaign has thought or will think through its responses. I can say that Faz Shakir, who's running the campaign, is a really smart guy.
I like him a lot.
Who came up in, actually a better era of the Center for American Progress and in Harry Reid's office. And, when we get to dust, we can talk all about that. That'll be fun. But, there are some really smart and pragmatic people around Bernie who, I think, and Bernie himself is no dummy. He is and he never gets credit for this, but although Matt Iglesias, I think, has done a very good job of, making the kind of pragmatic progressives case for Bernie for a while now, but he's actually had like a really impressive political career. If if you bought that Pete Buttigieg's 2 terms running a small college town in a not particularly distinguished way qualified him for higher office, then in addition to his years in the House and Senate, and where he has real accomplishments that he often gets sold short on, including one I know you'll agree on, the Yemen resolution. In addition to all of that, he was actually one of the best mayors in the country of the small but lively college town that I know you live in a college town yourself, so you may have thoughts about this, but that he ran for most of the Reagan era, I think almost exactly contemporaneous with the Reagan era, which he turned into one of the most livable cities in the country. And he, obviously running the country is completely different and the empire, but he did in that role where he came in as an out of nowhere socialist. He was actually known as a pretty pragmatic deal maker.
Let me say one other favorable thing about him, because it's the flip side of what I just said, which is, I just alluded to a perceived rigidity on his part that I think it would be good to dispel. But I will say that the stances that lead him to be perceived that way are a product of his earnestness, his authenticity, the fact that he really cares about these policies, and is willing to live or die by them. And that is, I think, an underrated asset that he has. I think not everyone appreciates the extent to which Trump got support in 2016 from people who just were sick of fake politicians. And so when Trump would say these outrageous things, and we're like, wow, won't this kill his campaign? Politicians don't say stuff like that. Well, that was a feature, not a bug, for people who wanted him to not be a politician. They took it as a kind of authenticity, even though that's personally not the way I would interpret it. And I think Bernie comes off, as if nothing else, authentic. And I think people underestimate how valuable that would be, and even the extent to which it might allow him to make some inroads on Trump's, white working class support.
Yeah, I think it's valuable in 2 different but fully complementary ways. One is that he could, to the extent swing voters exist, and they do, however small in number, and the legendary not the real Obama-Trump voter, who we would hope would be an Obama-Trump-Sanders voter. I think you're absolutely right in your diagnosis that he conveys authenticity, and that he'll be able to authentically say, for instance, Trump said he was going to bring jobs back to your steel town. He didn't. Instead, he enriched his cronies. I mean, that'll be the message, stuff like that. But also, and this I have a lot of up close, exposure to, no other candidate in my lifetime, except for Obama in 2008, and then he didn't do anything with it as president, has ever excited young people in the way that Bernie does. Right. And I have heard that publicly on Twitter, from no less of an authority than Tommy Vitor of Pod Save America, who of course worked in Obama's comms team and is probably, give or take, my age. And those guys, I've noticed the Pod Save bros, John Lovett and Dan Pfeiffer and John Favreau, have been noticeably gentler on Bernie and friendlier to him than a lot of Democratic establishment voices are. And I basically
of course, it was looking,
Ben Rhodes also.
It was for a while looking like he might be the actual president. And I would guess that the kinds of people who served in the Obama administration are very good at being nice to people who might well be president.
Sure.
I mean, I don't want to be too cynical. Look, they had their ideologies, but these guys are players, right? These guys are Washington players first and journalists second.
Well, actually, hold on. I'm gonna put a correction there. First of all, they're not Washington. They live in L.A. They've gone totally Hollywood.
No, but the ones who were in the Obama administration.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Well, it's true. They started a company. They started a media company.
They started a media company. They're, and my guess is that I think it's been incredibly lucrative for them. So my guess is that's probably what they want to keep doing. They want to stay relevant to their audience, which gives them a different set of incentives than a lot of people in Washington. But actually, I would push back on you, and I don't want to overly defend them. I have many criticisms of the PodSafe guys, but, which we don't need to get into. But I do want to say that, these are guys who got into politics, as idealistic, 20-somethings working on what was then in 2008 the most exciting campaign of anyone's lifetime. And they really believed in Barack Obama, and they really believed in the movement he built. These giant crowds of diverse young people he'd turn out in every place in the country. That was, the magic for them. And they helped craft the message that excited that. So, actually, when you look at the Washington political class and the kind of usual suspects of that class, the people you see on cable news all the time, they despise Bernie, and they despise Bernie 4 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and they despise Bernie right now. Despite the fact that there was obvious gathering momentum. And the reason they despise him, and there are many, but I think the central one is that he wants to take money out of politics. He wants to crack down on lobbying and the kind of way that business as usual works in Washington, which is threatening to anyone who works in the Dem establishment. But the PodSafe guys don't need to worry about that because they run a popular podcast. What they can recognize, meanwhile, is that this is real, that he really does excite young people in an authentic way, and they can appreciate that. And So and having been an Obama supporter in 2008 when I was 24, I just turned 36. I recognize it too, but I also think that what's happening with Bernie is more exciting in a certain respect because he's getting by less on his natural charisma, and obviously while he would be the first historic history-making Jewish president, that hasn't generated, a thousandth of the excitement that Obama's historic achievement was at the time. But I think really because he would excite a explicitly democratic socialist movement that would transform the country in ways that my generation finds very
just
exciting.
In American history,
nothing like it has ever
Jewish.
happened.
I mean, it's just, Sure.
I mean, I don't want to get into that at great length, although I will say that Jewish Currents, where I work, has done a series of articles, one by me, one by Joshua Leifer, maybe two by Joshua Leifer, and one by Bernie Sanders himself that address Bernie's Jewishness from various angles, and it is a very rich topic. But we'll table that.
So is Jewish Currents the new? I mean, it's to the left, clearly, given the fact that you're working there. Is it to some extent I mean, I don't pay that much attention to this part of the media landscape, but didn't the Forward used to be appreciably further left than it is?
I would say so, yeah.
So is it occupying some of that? Is Jewish Currents occupying some of that territory?
Yeah, you could say that. I don't want to put this out as an official message on behalf of the staff, but you could say that, that Jewish Currents, it's not as old as the Forward, but it's actually very old. It dates to 1946, and it was founded by members of the Communist Party, which if you wanted to call them Stalinists, you wouldn't be entirely off base. A few years later, it moved to something a little more, democratic than that, let's say. But for many years, it was, it had a following and an ideological core in the, roots of early 20th century Yiddish socialism, which is also the world that gave us actually on that spectrum, somewhat more moderate Forward, and also in a sense, the world that produced Bernie Sanders. But it got a revival with, an influx of money and then another greater influx of money very recently, just in the last 2 years, and in all millennial staff that's come on. Well, actually, we just hired our first new non-millennial staffer, Peter Beinart, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Oh, really? Yes, he just came on.
Where is it based? In New York or Washington?
It's based in New York, although some of the staffers live in Chicago and Minneapolis, but most of us are in New York. It's a brilliant team. It definitely feels like in the last 6 months or so, we've really had a moment. And we're just getting started. So, that's a bit of a digression, but Peter, it was just announced, I guess, like a month ago.
That means he'll be writing for you?
Yeah, mostly writing. His title is editor at large, and he still retains, roles at The Atlantic and at, CUNY Journalism School. Yeah. But he left the Forward for us, which, you can read into that whatever you want. Or honestly, you should have Peter on to talk about this in more detail. I'm sure that would be great.
I may well.
Yeah.
Before I think you wanted to talk about, some foreign policy stuff, including pieces you've written about, foreign policy with respect to both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. First, I want to say one more thing about Bernie's electability. And, the conventional wisdom is definitely that he'd have trouble against Trump. If you look at in the betting markets, if you look at both the odds given him with respect to getting the nomination and his odds of beating Trump, or his odds of being the next, what is it? Anyway, you can infer the comparison between him and Biden, on electability, and people see a really stark difference. And I just would say, if you imagine the two of them on a debate stage against Trump, Bernie might have his issues, but with Biden, I think there's the real danger. And I'm not among those who think he has like dementia. I just think he's a 77-year-old guy whose brain is working about as well as a lot of 77-year-old guys' brains work, which is like not all that terrifically, probably better than mine will be, but whatever. But I do think there's a real danger of people saying, wow, I've been spending the last 4 years assuming that Trump was kind of out of it and you don't really want a guy like this running the government, but it's not clear that there's a really sharp contrast here. I mean, it depends. Biden has his good nights and his bad nights, but I can see that becoming a significant problem in a way it definitely won't with Bernie.
I mean, remarkably, although Bernie is 78 and he did suffer a heart attack last fall, his mind seems to be in precisely the same condition it's been his entire life. Unlike a lot of politicians, you can go back and watch a speech of his from any era and he sounds exactly the same. He's on exactly the same message. But not because he, doesn't think about anything else. Well, maybe, but he, he by all accounts is operating at a really high level right now. It's not totally clear to me that Biden is, or for that matter, that the president is. Electability is, as many others have said, a kind of a messy thing for regular people to try to measure. I mean, it becomes self-fulfilling. Like, people in the political class will tell you that someone's electable, and then that, the public hears that and thinks it must be true. But the truth is, there are reasons to doubt Biden's electability that you've brought up. He does seem like he's in a fragile state. He hasn't demonstrated really any knack for campaigning in this, or for that matter, in his previous presidential bids when he was much younger, which were complete disasters. And
well, he does retail politics well because he's likable, and but
in theory, I mean, my sense is
when he's not slipping up and saying things that aren't true or something.
My sense is that Biden, the key thing he has going for him is that he was vice president for 8 years in a generally popular administration, and there's a comfort level with him. I mean, people kind of know what to expect, and even if he is fading fast, I think we kind of know what administration we'll get. And what we know the general shape of things. And I think that will be reassuring to a lot of people, and it might well be what gets him the nomination. It might well get him the presidency. But I also think, and you've identified them beautifully, that there are major risks with him. There are obviously major risks with Sanders, but there are major upsides too. The youth movement that I think he can excite could be game changing. The authenticity we talked about could be game changing. But also, I believe in what he stands for. And, actually, this will make a good segue. I also believe in what he stands for on foreign policy. And what's more, I'm pretty sure you do too.
No, if I could just magically put any candidate in the White House and didn't have to worry about electability, I would definitely put Bernie there, because it's not that I'm as far left as he is on domestic policy, but I put a lot of emphasis on foreign policy, and I think, by my ideological lights, he is by far the best bet.
Yeah,
in the crowd.
So let's talk about that. And I'm gonna, after a somewhat contentious first act, I actually I'm gonna butter you up a little here, Bob, because I'm gonna express some gratitude. Because, you took me under your wing and you gave me what, in a sense, was my first gig in media, however unconventional it was. And a big part of that job was, listening to long and intelligent conversations between all kinds of people. And honestly, I feel like I was inevitably going to get on Twitter anyway, but the way I kind of got on Twitter was to better monitor the discourse every day, see who was arguing about what with whom. It became an essential part of the job. And one major element of that, since you specifically...
Oh God. So you mean it was within my power to save Twitter from you?
To save
I could have
the
kept you
country
from
and
ever
the world.
showing up?
This is all your fault, Bob, is really what I'm saying.
If I had fired you...
If you had fired me, well, if you hadn't hired me in the first place. But, to get more specific and granular about this, because you brought me on specifically to work on the Worldwise series, which I guess isn't running anymore, among other things. So, I was constantly following international news, and, my view of the world was actually still kind of forming back then in some ways. And the constant exposure to the range of perspectives that you've always described, I think, well, as progressive realist, which was such a fringe view in Washington. I mean, no one had even coined the blob yet. No one had talked about, why don't we have a real left foreign policy apparatus? But on the other hand, if you had as a regular show hosted that I edited sometimes, Foreign Entanglements, by Matt Duss and Rob Farley. Matt Duss is now Bernie's foreign policy advisor, and if I get my way, will be, national security advisor or something like that. And Rob Farley is Matt's close friend and mentor, who I would not be at all surprised.
Rob is Matt's mentor?
Yeah, Rob is a bit older than Matt, and well, it's also
did Matt study under him or anything?
Yeah, Matt I think also came late to he didn't really get his degree, as I recount in my profile. We'll discuss, until his early 30s. So yeah, but Rob was also at his wedding and stuff. I mean, they're really close, and I think Farley is probably the sort of person you might expect to see working in a Sanders administration. I'm just guessing here. And so are lots of other people.
I sometimes wonder how close he is to Matt ideologically. I'm not convinced, but maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, go ahead. The funny thing is, at the time when you talked about progressive realism, it often seemed like this very out there view. It was so outside the DC mainstream. A lot has happened to change that. And I actually think that among the multiple hats I wear, Twitter asshole, Bernie champion, Jewish Currents editor, whatever. Another one is, and maybe the one I think I've done my best work in the last 2 years, or certainly the last year, is a kind of reported chronicling of the emergence of exactly what you were always talking about, that progressive realist movement. I mean, it doesn't exactly call itself that, but, or left foreign policy, or just, kind of shaking off the blob, and a series of articles I've written primarily for The Nation. So if you go back a little over a year, you would have, I reviewed Ben Rhodes's memoir, and ended up interviewing him for that. And you can read both the review and by the way, speaking of Tommy Vietor, the podcast they do, Pod Save the World, Ben Rhodes and Tommy Vietor do, is, it's pretty good as, as mainstream. I mean, there's an irony, which is that Ben Rhodes apparently helped coin the term the blob with Obama. And the podcast does occasionally have, I think, its blob-esque moments. It hasn't entirely escaped the blob. But I recommend the podcast as
I'm not a regular listener, but I agree with that. And I thought talking to Ben was very interesting. And if you go back and see what we talked about, it was mostly me trying to ask him about you were facing all this pressure from the same people you and I can't stand, Bob, the neocons, the
some
lobby,
of my best friends are neocons.
Some of your best friends that,
they are. I like Eli Lake.
Eli Lake and so on.
But
anyway, they were facing so much aggressive pressure from them. But I would say, did you ever feel like you got the same kind of organized pressure from the left to, do things in a more peaceful and diplomatic way? And he was like, no, that pressure didn't exist. It would have been nice if it had. And we talked about what I think is probably going to go down in history as a really seminal moment in the formation of a progressive foreign policy movement, which was the Iran deal, which I know you championed, and you were close with a lot of the people who did. And it was interesting because that was an Obama Ben Rhodes joint that also brought in a kind of ad hoc coalition of groups like Win Without War and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, Plowshares, and so on, and certain pundits. to kind of, people like Trita Parsi, obviously, to kind of create a movement. And I didn't really chronicle that at the time, but I certainly followed and supported it. But fast forwarding, after the Ben Rhodes thing, I profiled Matt Duss, which is one of the pieces I'm proudest of for The Nation about a year ago. And that was the first profile anyone had done of him. There've been a few since. They've usually referred back to mine. And, I also did, what was next after that? I did a piece that I've always had a little bit of trouble describing, but it was basically about, the Yemen war and how it had become the kind of new, focal point for, where left foreign policy was going. And I talked to Bernie himself for that. I talked to Matt. I talked to a lot of other people, talked to like Chris Murphy and Ro Khanna. And then I followed that up with a reported piece about the Quincy Institute, where I talked to all of the co-founders of that, Trita Parsi, Stephen Wertheim, Suzanne DiMaggio, Eli Clifton, and Andrew Basovich. And then recently I did one, there was the first profile anyone's done of Sasha Baker, Elizabeth Warren's foreign policy advisor. So I look at these, and then I have plans I won't get into, but potentially for, the next chapter in this saga. But I feel like if you go back and look over all those pieces, all of which I'm proud of, you can see the emergence of, a sort of a counter blob.
Absolutely.
It's much smaller than the blob. It's also, as you point out, in some ways enmeshed with, the nature of the blob is that it absorbs people, right? So you could come in with, some very progressive ideas and then you actually work in foreign policy and you get implicated. And Ben Rhodes is a really interesting case in point. I know that Sarah Lazar at, In These Times has written a scathing piece about Ben Rhodes, and his complicity in various Obama-era crimes, above all the war in Yemen. Now, if you talk to Ben Rhodes, he's, she would say cynically rebranded himself. I would maybe say liberated himself, as, one of the main champions against the war. And people can get into those debates. Ben Rhodes can defend himself also. And I've aired both sides of that in that Yemen piece in particular. But I think that, he's an illustrative case of someone who I think you could look at him as somebody who went into Washington and ended up, selling the Iran deal and, opening relations with Cuba and you could also look and changing the tenor of our relationship with Israel to some extent, or trying to, or stopping us from doing strikes on Syria, which everyone else in the administration wanted to do. Or you could look at him as someone who is complicit in the drone wars and, the weapons we actually did sell to Israel and what we actually did do in Yemen, and any number of other things.
And in Syria. We did funnel weapons in a way that was,
I don't think Ben is the father of that particular strategy, but it's totally fair to say that. But I think that I'm fascinated by him as a figure because I think it's generally fair to say that of Obama's senior foreign policy advisors, he had the most untraditional background, and he was probably
he had an MFA in creative writing or something.
Yeah, well, he'd also interned at the Wilson Center, but he was a young comms guy. He was a would-be novelist. He was not your conventional blobby, which a lot of people hated and resented and saw as a bad thing. I thought it was kind of interesting to have someone with a fresh perspective, and I think there are some tangible things that it brought about, however much Trump may have subsequently endangered them. So I look at him, and then I look at someone like Matt Duss, who also, as people can read into my profile, has a wildly unconventional background for someone in foreign policy, and one that, people like me might find relatable, kind of breaking into punditry. And Christ, he had a Bloggingheads show for years, and he could be running U.S. foreign policy. And how can I not find that inspirational? How can you not find that inspirational?
I expect no less of Bloggingheads alumni.
But he also is, as I'm sure he'd be the first to admit, he lives in Washington or in Northern Virginia. He knows a lot of people in that world, like Heather Hurlburt, who also is a Bloggingheads host. he talks to Ben Rhodes and Tommy Vitor and is friends with them. And, he's not, he is not actually like a bomb-throwing anti-imperialist radical. He just seems that way when you compare him to most of the bloc.
I do think, people should appreciate, if they haven't paused to appreciate, that for Bernie Sanders to be as close as he is to the nomination right now, as with the votes uncounted, although there are probably exit polls you and I don't know about that may tell the story, but just for him to be given on Super Tuesday like a 35% chance of getting the nomination, and to have said some of the things he said about foreign policy is remarkable in a way, given the recent history of American foreign policy, and I think he really deserves credit for some of the candor. I think, the way was in an odd way kind of paved by Trump, who, one thing Trump demonstrated, and this is maybe as disappointing as anything else, but is that, voters don't care very much about foreign policy. I mean, when he first went after John McCain and people said, "Oh, he's toast. You can't say that in American politics."
Right.
And it turned out nobody actually cares. And
I would be lying if I despise Trump and think he's a monster in every sense, and that's no surprise to anyone. But I would be lying if I said, if I didn't acknowledge, and I think there are people on the left who would, that there have been aspects of the Trump era. They're the least of it. They are, to be crystal clear, vastly outweighed by the damage he's done to everything. Kids on the border and everything else, to the environment. But there is a level in which specifically Trump has, what's the word I'm looking for? Refreshing seems a little off, but like he's like, I get at a basic level why people wanted to see the system get shaken up. And I think a lot of people can get that if they think about it. I get the revulsion at our bipartisan elites at the swamp, even though, to be clear again, Trump has only made the swamp swampier
and these
than
are
ever.
some of the forces Bernie would harness.
These are some of the forces Bernie would harness. And, in a direct way, if you want to talk about his foreign policy and Matt Duss, Matt Duss was hired by Bernie, like a month or two after the 2016 election. And, Bernie was often criticized in 2016 for not really having much to say about foreign policy, although the few things he did say, that he supported Palestinian rights and that he wasn't friends with Henry Kissinger, which he said in debates with Hillary, were wonderful moments. And he's always had that kind of left streak, but it wasn't his focus. He was running on domestic stuff, on inequality and oligarchy and all that. And when Hillary lost and it, and Trump won and the whole system was blown open, I think Bernie, sorry, I'm distracted by something. I think that Bernie, realized, along with a lot of other people, that the rules were being rewritten, and also that he could, actually develop a voice for himself on foreign policy. And there are various things that Duss has done, but I think the single most notable, and is that he got Bernie talking about the Yemen war, which, to briefly recap, the Obama administration very late in his second term, and I think in sort of tandem with the Iran deal to reassure our horrific Saudi allies, started supporting their bombardment of the Houthi rebels in Yemen, on the grounds that they supposedly represent Iranian expansion. And it's been a major humanitarian catastrophe. It's caused famine and disease, and it's just completely morally indefensible. And Bernie started talking about it basically when he hired Matt Duss. And the senator who deserves the initial credit for opposing it while Obama was still president is actually the more mainstream liberal Chris Murphy of Connecticut. But Murphy, I think, and maybe Rand Paul tried to pass a resolution while Obama was still president, which was focused on not selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, and it was a flop. Bernie came up with a much more clever idea, and also Obama wasn't president, so Democrats were more receptive to it, but so were a few Republicans like Mike Lee, who co-sponsored it. his idea was that we should challenge this on constitutional grounds, that we should reassert Congress's right to make war, and say that the executive branch, starting under Obama and then greatly expanded under Trump, was basically waging an unconstitutional war by backing the Saudis in Yemen. And he got majorities of both the House and Senate, Ro Khanna being his partner in the House, to support a resolution on those grounds.
Ro Khanna, by the way, is a very impressive guy.
He is.
It's like, where did he come from? I mean, and
Silicon Valley.
But how does he get away with his foreign policy stuff in Silicon Valley, or I mean, just anywhere in America where there's he's edgy.
I think I think one thing that the advocates of a more progressive foreign policy will make, one case they'll make, someone like Stephen Wertheim, who is, in addition to someone I reported on, and I disclosed this at the time, is also a good friend, and I think he's been on your program, right?
Yeah, he has.
Yeah, super smart guy, really, really terrific guy. And he is the co-founder of the Quincy Institute. And one thing someone like him will say is that these ideas are popular. Like, actually, people will say that about Bernie's ideas across the board. A lot of times they're more popular than the Beltway or the media will let on. But specifically on foreign policy, most veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars think they were a mistake and want them to end. And it's really like a zombie consensus that's being challenged right now in Washington. Just people who are completely blinkered and just don't listen to or care about the public at all. Yeah, no accountability to the public.
Yeah. No, and you were right to say that interesting things are happening in foreign policy. I mean, the Quincy Institute's interesting because it has people we might call progressive realists, but it also has conservative realists. It's just a realist think tank, and it's the first. Well, I mean, realism
and they're funded in equal amounts as founding donors by Charles Koch and George Soros, which is actually unprecedented for them to go in at the ground floor of something in the way that they did, and
totally.
It really speaks to. That there, I mean, I am, as I'm sure already made clear on here, not a big fan of conservatives or Republicans, but I do understand in part from Bloggingheads that there is a strain of, kind of libertarian minded, anti-war thought that while I don't know that it,
well, there's also a Buchananite, anti-war contingent within, conservatism. Represented by the American Conservative Magazine now.
Right. Which I find a little more troubling, although I have a friendly...
It has some of the, a little bit of the ethno-nationalist flavor that the libertarians by and large don't have. But I mean, honestly, right now I'll kind of take the allies. I mean, up to a point, I wouldn't want completely abhorrent human beings as allies in the foreign policy wars, but
we want to end the wars. We want to end the wars.
And just usher in, the world I'd like to usher in foreign policy, would lead to a place where there would be divergences within this coalition because not all of these conservatives are as enthusiastic about, say, global governance and so on, and as respectful of international law as I'd like. So we've been going at this a while. I know you wanted to, critically say something critical about Bloggingheads, but before we do that, David, I'm going to leave time for it, but I do want to just, final thing I would leave with, on the note that we started on, the BernieBro issue. I would encourage you to, not that you have to listen to me, but you did have that, you paid that misty-eyed tribute to Bloggingheads. I started to tear up a little, you could tell. I didn't go as far as, Biden went with Buttigieg and say you remind me of my son, but that's because I don't have a son, I have two daughters. Can
I just quickly say on that Biden also said, I've never said this to anyone before, and then someone immediately dug up an example of him saying it about someone else.
A whole mashup of Biden saying to randomly selected Americans that they remind him of their son.
Yeah, this is just one of the many delightful things we'll be dealing with if we do not.
He will be nothing if not entertaining, if he's, should he be either president or the Democratic candidate. But on the note of your Manichaeism and it sounds as if maybe you've learned a little something from the infamous tweet, although there must have been a certain kind of positive reinforcement from being nationally notorious and part of a Bloomberg ad. But There is a tweet more recent than that I would just like to raise a question about. It's about, okay, when Buttigieg dropped out, you say, hey, great news. Well, first of all, somebody reminds you, actually, tactically, it's bad news for Bernie. You get through that. But then you say, also, I'd like to congratulate the Pete Buttigieg of early 2019 on a spirited campaign. Okay, next sentence is, the Pete Buttigieg of mid-2019 to present, however, is an absolute rat and deserves only contempt. And I hope you didn't mean that literally. And by the way, I use literally the way people of my generation do, not the way millennials do. And with that in mind, I hope you didn't mean that literally, that he deserves only contempt. But I mean, there is this kind of binary quality to this kind of Manichaean quality to this tweet that is,
Yeah. I mean, I would be dishonest if I didn't say I'm playing to my base a little when I do a tweet like that, which is not to say I don't feel it. It's not to say that it's a cynical decision, but I'm fully aware that, I mean, you're not wrong that, Twitter is tribal and it, when I call Pete a rat, which many people have been doing, and, that I set off a certain reaction with a certain cohort, and also obviously piss off some other people. I guess but
it can also be tactically counterproductive for the candidate you are seen as representing. That's the point I would make. Anyway, go ahead. Sure.
So I was going to criticize Bloggingheads a little bit, but what I really want to do is give a kind of, deep thought about Twitter. But it's about Twitter. It's about, tribalism. It's about polarization versus civility, the things. So, okay, let's start with the criticism of Bloggingheads.
Be discreet and remember before you say anything, you've had access to inside information. You remember the NDA you signed, when I gave you that generous severance package, right?
Yes, that definitely happened. That's a real thing. Still spending that severance package down.
I would imagine.
Later. No, I will do my best not to reveal internals, but I don't think I'll have to because, part of Bloggingheads is that you've been
complete transparency.
Yeah, recording everything you think about everything.
We don't edit.
For over a decade now. I do always tell people how incredibly, how remarkable it is that you've kept this site going, I think, through force of will for well over a decade now. And how much, technology and how we consume media has changed in that time also. I mean, in a way, you anticipated podcasting years before.
And yet, ironically,
you haven't made a
become a podcaster with a Joe Rogan-sized audience.
Yeah, but there is something very pure about what you do, and I respect that. I do, and it was a really valuable learning experience in multiple ways for me, and exposed me to a lot of viewpoints. But it also, I think I ran up against certain limits. And this is not why I left. I left because I got a better job, but,
better job.
Yeah, I imagine. But I think I had a frustration that has probably informed some of my subsequent thinking, which was the focus on these matchups between, left and right. Between the two sides.
Well, it's hardly all we do, but sure. I'll take your point. It's what we were best known for early on.
And it was something that you were, okay, I guess I'm giving away internals a little bit here, but it was something that you were often pushing for more of. And it was awkward because I think everyone who worked there was some stripe of left of center, from a bit left of center to wherever I am, but, Democrats generally. And that was no secret, but the problem I found was, the pool, you also had, I think, and have some intellectual standards for who would come on. I mean, you wanted smart people. You wanted people who would make intellectually honest arguments. And as, I'm hardly the only person to ever argue this, but there is just not as large a pool of intellectually serious people on the right. Moreover, they are heavily white and male, which also affected the demographics.
Can I just say on the claim that there aren't as many intellectually serious, honest, whatever you said, people on the right? I just, again, in my role as your surrogate father, I would just encourage you to just whenever you think something like that, ask yourself, because it is so obviously the kind of thing that could result from the kinds of, egocentric cognitive biases we all have, to just ask yourself if maybe your vision is a little blurred when you think something like that.
But to be honest, I used to be more open to that kind of thinking. I mean, it's actually been something I've kind of transitioned away from. I mean, I was always liberal and I always thought the Republicans were horrible, but I used to be, I think, more generous in my interest in conservative thinking, and there's still little corners of it. Actually, one thing I'm going to do a quick plug for, it's not mine, but a really good podcast that you should listen to and that other people should listen to is the Know Your Enemies podcast, or Know Your Enemy podcast, by my aforementioned friend Sam Adler-Bell and by Matt.
Is he the one who interviews people who are actually his enemies or something? What is it?
No, mostly he doesn't, although he just did the first one of that, which was with Ross Douthat, who I think we can agree is one of the handful of intellectually serious conservative writers.
Well, I wouldn't say handful necessarily, but he is, I would say, in a certain sense, he's the most cerebral columnist for the Times.
Yeah, no, I would too. Or, well, I don't know. I don't want to be mean to Jamal Bowie, for instance, but
if you wonder why I haven't gone farther in life, it's not easy to insult like 11 influential people with one short sentence, but I just did that, didn't I?
Look, Bob, in some ways you modeled the behavior that I now espouse on my platform, but, but what I was going to say is that, but oftentimes, and I will strenuously avoid naming any names here, but oftentimes I felt like not only were we sometimes making allowances for people who I didn't think had very interesting things to say on the right, but we were also missing out on opportunities to create very fruitful discussions, not necessarily debates, although sometimes debates, but very fruitful discussions among smart, intellectually honest people who took some baseline assumptions about the world as a given. Because
we've had a lot of intra-ideological discussion over the years, certainly.
Let me make very clear, you have, and I still, to this day, sometimes listen to Bloggingheads discussions. You've had some brilliant, wonderful people on this show throughout its, on the website throughout its entire run. And, you know, the advantage of the Bloggingheads format was always that you didn't really edit it. You just kind of broke it up into segments and you could really hear people think at length, which in many ways does anticipate where podcasting eventually went.
A lot of podcasts are highly produced. It did anticipate Joe Rogan. I mean, that's his, he took that to extremes.
But for that matter, I mean, they're totally different in their ideological tenor and stuff. But, you know, something like Chapo Trap House, is basically an unedited free-for-all.
But much more what you're recommending. I mean, like-minded people, and of course, it's as much political comedy as it is,
and we don't have to get into them at great length. But I'll say that I found, first of all, that I think knowing what you believe, while it can lead to blinkered fanaticism, and I try to be open-minded. And I mean, I hope, for instance, we've had a very civil discussion here where we've civilly disagreed. So it's not like I can't do that. It's not like I'm totally closed off to criticism or to, you know, civilly arguing my point. It's not that I can't do that, but I do feel that structuring things, as you sometimes, but certainly not always have, but also as, you know, cable news does all the time, as a kind of like, here's a right-wing voice and here's a left-wing voice and they're going to argue, can actually produce a lot of the time intensely boring, repetitive, and stupid debates. Because it's like, we get it. Like, one of you thinks government should be bigger and one of you thinks it should be smaller. One of you thinks that global warming is an urgent crisis and one of you doesn't believe it's real or doesn't believe it's urgent, you know, et cetera, et cetera. One of you believes this set of facts on guns and one of you believes this set of NRA-approved talking points on guns. And we can go down the list.
Well, I tried to find people who don't just do talking points, but you don't always succeed. And
when you do that, you often end up, I think, with an interesting mix of idiosyncratic paleocons, libertarians, you know, people who aren't necessarily reflective of Republican establishment thinking, but have a conservative streak in their thinking. And there are some interesting thinkers in that world. You know, Catholic traditionalists who might have interesting things to say, even if I might find some of their views abhorrent. And the Know Your Enemy podcast, by the way, the basic idea is that they study conservative intellectuals. They might do an episode about William F. Buckley, or the episode I did with them was all about Norman Podhoretz. But
I actually did hear that. That was good.
Yeah, thank you.
So I did listen to that.
Yeah. So, you know,
a lot about Norman Podhoretz.
Well, I read Making It, and so did they, and we all enjoyed it. So I actually think that is a model of the discourse I like best, more than some of my, you know, louder Twitter behavior. I sometimes try to do that kind of discourse on Twitter too when I'm in a calmer mood. But that, or what we're doing now, or what I write, you know, is written from a point of view, which is a broadly kind of democratic socialist point of view. It thinks that certain things are good, like that everyone should have healthcare, and certain things are bad, like neo-Nazism, you know, or tax cuts for the rich or whatever. It makes those assumptions, and I could argue out at length why I think those things are true. But I have found, as I've gotten older, actually, that those arguments are less provocative, less intellectually stimulating, and less politically galvanizing than intra-left debates or just interviews with people who know what they're talking about and have a solid framework for engaging with the world.
Yeah, but I do think the Trump era has brought a whole new kind of argument for, well, knowing your enemy and engaging. I just think so many people in the resistance, I mean, I want to say two things here. So many people in the resistance just kind of don't seem to understand ways in which, as I've already suggested, things they do and say actually help Trump. That's because they don't understand the nature of Trump's support and really the diversity of it, different kinds of people who support him, but because they have caricatured the enemy, because they think all of his supporters just flat out racists and that's the end of the story. And so I think there's now a new kind of argument for kind of crossing ideological bounds. But the other thing I want to say is that the other thing the resistance has shown me is, you know, you earlier suggested that, well, there's much more of a dearth of intellectual seriousness and honesty on the right than on the left. I have just been stunned by how many even prominent people in the resistance either are undergoing like major lapses of logic and analysis, or are just pretending to for purpose of saying the kinds of things that get them followers. And I don't think you do that, the latter.
Appreciate that.
But for some of them, I think it is calculated, and for some of them, maybe it becomes an addiction. But I've just seen, it's just been a nonstop exhibit of cognitive biases at play on the left. And I do it too. I do it too. But I mean, the magnitude and consistency of it has kind of blown my mind.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you've said this about the resistance, because at least in the circles I travel in, and certainly on Twitter, the left and the resistance are actually very distinct parts of the political spectrum.
In fact, look, some of the great skeptics of the part of the resistance mindset I'm talking about are on the left.
Yes.
To the left of the average resistor.
Right. So I'll say, since I find that the mainstream media screws this up a lot, and for the benefit of whatever viewers or listeners here are confused about this, to my mind, left and liberal are distinct things, and liberal has much heavier, though by no means sole, overlap with what calls itself the resistance. The resistance also seems to include some never-Trumpers and centrists and so on. But, you know, the resistance, to my mind, you know, when that term first emerged in the immediate wake of Trump's win, I didn't hate it. I understood it was a reference to the French Revolution. It was a reference to Star Wars. Not the French Revolution, the Vichy France. Although that's an inauspicious comparison, since the French resistance has been heavily exaggerated. But never mind that.
You could lose your job for making a World War II reference like that in media.
Well, depends which. I don't think that's why Chris Matthews lost his job. I think it was
it's not the only reason. I just thought, well, just quick footnote. I didn't think it was as egregious as Chuck Todd, quoting without evident disapproval, somebody calling, Sanders supporters brown shirts. Was that it? He was talking about Sanders supporters?
Something like that. I will say, having watched Chuck Todd a bit in this primary cycle, he is really dreadful, really one of the worst.
I don't pay that much attention. I just thought that was a more egregious crime. Of course, yeah, Matthews, you're right. There's a whole lengthy indictment, that ultimately caught up with him. Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah. Anyway, just to say, the resistance, it quickly came to seem like something really unappealing. Not to say I don't have friends who or people I'm friendly with or respect who still probably use that label. But overall, I would say the cohort I identify with, kind of jeers at the resistance and sees itself as the left. Now, I would say the left, although there are many strains of it, the mainstream of the left is generally people who are for Bernie right now, and who, are anti-war and, anti-corporate power, and they probably also share a lot of the identitarian, they are pro-gay rights and feminist and pro-Black Lives Matter and so on. But there is some skepticism
of identity politics on the left.
So there are some strains of it that are openly skeptical of the entire idea of identity politics. I don't like that strain and have criticized it and have sparred with it. But I do think there is a wider discomfort with with a certain kind of identity politics that no one really knows how to articulate without setting off unproductive fights in the left. But that the way that the resistance might cynically weaponize it. And in a way, if we go back to my lists tweet that you cited earlier and you break down what I was saying in it, you can kind of see me making that exact critique the way I think it should be made.
Wow, that's a pretty subtle reading of that tweet. You'll have to elaborate.
It's a subtle reading of the tweet. But what did I say in the tweet? I said, libs, probably resistance libs, who,
flirting with Bloomberg,
who say they care about racism and sexual harassment when really they only care about money and power. So what am I saying there? I'm saying, okay, you all go on TV and you say that the Bernie bros are a bunch of misogynist white boys who, are total assholes and, are anti-identity politics. They're not woke like us. But then, it turns out Bernie has a very diverse coalition in all respects, by race, by gender, by everything. And his own platform and record is as woke as you can get on that stuff, even if it's not necessarily the main thing he likes to talk about. It is intersectional, whereas the kind of people who were saying that are willing to work for a guy who is, I don't want to get myself in legal trouble here, but let's say has been sued many times for sexual harassment and, who, for 12 years defended the, in retrospect, unconstitutional and racist stop and frisk program, and has said many racist and racially insensitive things too. And so what bothers me is not wokeness or identity politics per se. I don't think we can build a left that's not intersectional and isn't, and doesn't respect everyone and fight for everyone's rights in very specific ways. I believe in all of that. What pisses me off is people who weaponize that kind of rhetoric to attack the left and then turn around and take money from people who are, and support people who are total monsters by their own standards. It's the cynical weaponization of wokeness and identity politics that gives them a bad name, when the reality is they are a noble tradition the left stands with and should defend.
Well, I'm against cynical weaponization of all kinds, but I will say that is a subtle reading of your tweet. And so my final bit of paternal advice would be, never attribute too much subtlety to your audience.
Well, there's something to that, but, here's my last thought about Twitter. Twitter is a very mixed bag. I've had some bad days on it. I've had some bad days on it recently. I've never deleted my account or logged off for any length of time, but I understand why people do. And I particularly understand and should acknowledge in the spirit of intersectionalism that it is harder if you're a woman, it's harder if you're a person of color, et cetera, et cetera. It's no treat if you're Jewish either, as I am. Sometimes people will tweet ovens or anti-Semitic caricatures at you, and that's no fun either. But I've gotten it from every faction. I've been attacked by neocons, libertarians, centrists, mainstream liberals, Hillary people, the far left, sometimes my own friends and cohort. And you have to develop a thick skin. It can be really difficult, but it has also,
you don't have to. You could just tweeting the thing. You could tweeting the things that lead to massive attacks being launched at you.
Well, if you're going to speak frankly,
but I take your point. I mean, you're going to take incoming if you say anything of significance at all, and you have a prominent platform. That's
yes.
true.
And of course, I had to do things to get to that platform in the first place, to that level of prominence in the first place, which I should still keep in perspective. I'm not like famous, but media seems to know who I am. But politics and media seem to know who I am. But I also think about who is my audience on Twitter, because there's been a robust debate recently, and there was I thought a very good piece in the Times by Charlie Warzel the other week about this. There's been a robust debate about, is Twitter real life or not? And people will at various times say Twitter isn't real life, and then sometimes they'll joke that it is. I have a very nuanced take on this, but I think, okay, which I think I share with Charlie Warzel, which is, first of all, obviously Twitter is real life. It's real. It exists. There are real live people on it. It's as real as a phone conversation or a Skype conversation or an exchange of letters or a New York Times article. People are writing, people are reading, people are communicating. It's real. It would be extremely stupid to say it wasn't. And and people who obsess over cancel culture know full well that lives get destroyed on Twitter, or profoundly altered anyway. Reputations get destroyed. So it's real. At the same time, the sense in which it's not real life is that, the political discourse you see on Twitter is not representative of the wider electorate. It's not, you go on Twitter and you'd find hardly anyone who seems to actually like Joe Biden. And then it turns out lots of people are voting for Joe Biden. So clearly, it's not an accurate representation of the electorate. So what is Twitter? And I would argue that what Twitter is the most radically open insider platform and the most radically inclusive insider platform ever created in human history. It is for the broadest definition of insiders that has ever existed. Not everyone who uses Twitter is an insider. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people on it, but there are probably, and for any major field, whether it's politics, entertainment, tech, whatever, there are probably tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people who I would say are in the conversation. You're one, I'm one, most people who go on Bloggingheads are one, to varying degrees. And it's hard to get a precise definition. It's not just if you have a blue check, although it often is.
It has made the bounds surrounding the elite and the elite conversation more porous.
Vastly more
porous.
More
permeable. Now, in that regard, it's just another step in where the internet has, in some ways, taken us broadly. I mean, blogging gave uncredentialed people who had well-articulated opinions an entree they would not have had in the old, in the old media system. But at the same time, I would say that there tends to be these periods of decentralization tend to be followed by centralization. It's like for a while there were a lot of little blogs, and actually you're seeing this happening in podcasting now. The age of podcasting is pretty much ending. The age of classic podcasting is ending. More and more, it's dominated by well-financed, highly produced podcasts on major platforms. And, the same thing happened with blogs. So I don't know where Twitter is heading, but there's no doubt that this has happened. It's, in a way, this is why Trump is president. In general, elite bastions of all kind are more readily stormed now.
Yeah, they are. And of course, it's a disaster that Trump is president, but it's also the reason that a Sanders presidency would be possible, which obviously I see as a good thing. It's the reason that a lot of things are possible that weren't before. But I'm struck that a lot of the elite media discourse around Twitter, a lot of Twitter's most vociferous critics are, sinicured cable news hosts or New York Times columnists or other people who have had success in older forms of media, and make real money and have sort of secure careers in that world, for whom Twitter is all downside, because while they might get on it, they might get addicted to it, they see why they need to be on it. What they quickly discover is that it's a platform that before there was the elite world they traveled in, the tiny, tiny world of paid elite media and their friends and family and stuff. And then there were the masses who just had to passively consume whatever they said, and they would get no real pushback from them. But because of Twitter, and the blogosphere was a kind of first step in this direction, but it's been utterly turbocharged by Twitter. Because of Twitter, they now have their mentions flooded every time they say something that's off to any demographic. And this has been traumatic for a lot of them. But I look at it in a positive way, which is a lot of careers, a lot of really impressive and exciting careers have been launched via that. It has allowed people from historically underrepresented groups, which have never had remotely that kind of access to power, to make their voices heard in powerful ways. And it has shaken up the conversation and shaken up a lot of conventional wisdom. And the truth is, while there are a lot of bleeding idiots on Twitter, and I deal with the ones I think are all the time, overall, compared to Facebook, for instance, which has a vastly larger user base.
Well, it's less of an elite. It's more of a grassroots thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
Facebook is designed to be the entire planet's high school reunion. It's designed to keep you in touch with you, the normal person, in touch with all the normal people you've ever known. Twitter is not really effective for being used that way, because most people will go on Twitter, they'll get 20 followers, that they'll say things that will just be shouted into the abyss, and they'll mostly end up using it to read a relatively small group of people. But although it's still way larger than the traditional elite was by orders of magnitude, but it's still a relatively small group of people. And so, that small group of people, it's a kind of way to bootstrap your way into thought leadership. And there are various cynical and gross ways to do it. But overall, I would say the average Twitter account with a notable following and that's in the conversation, these are actually pretty smart people on average, and they're pretty they're highly informed across the political spectrum.
Sure, there's a ton of
highly informed,
ton of smart stuff on Twitter.
People.
I would, and it's
which is all to say that when I'm on Twitter and I'm getting my message, whatever it is out there, something I've become cognizant of is that there are a lot of regular people probably seeing what I'm saying, but for the most part, I am addressing the elite. I'm addressing the elite in very broadly defined. I'm addressing insiders across the spectrum. I'm getting into their heads. They're getting into mine. And there's, a kind of a Twitter hoi polloi that numbers in the hundreds of thousands or the millions that's watching and weighing in and commenting, but is still a minuscule sliver of the actual electorate in the country, and probably a highly unrepresentative sliver. So, notwithstanding that it went in a Bloomberg ad, how many people see my obnoxious tweets? It's in the grand scheme of things.
But
it's small.
But it's
but the people who do see it are very influential. And it's
right. Okay, so it's not nothing. And in general,
it's a kind of power. It's a kind of power. But I'm just saying, the average voter doesn't know what a BernieBro is and isn't mad at BernieBros and hasn't been harassed on Twitter by BernieBros, whether they're voting for Bernie or not. The people who
but let me just say one thing. We should draw this to a close pretty soon. We've been doing it a while, but I would say that, first of all, everything you say is true. You're just one person. You're just one BernieBro, if you accept that label. I would say two things. If we all spent all of our time accurately assessing our influence, we'd never do anything or never take certain kinds of responsibilities seriously. My vote has never made the difference in an election. And yet, if everyone stayed at home because the same is true of them, democracy would fall apart. And moreover, let me say,
but don't sell yourself short, Bob, because the reality is you're not just an average voter.
Okay, fine,
you're a best-selling author with a large Twitter following this platform, which means and the people who read your books and follow your presence. No, I'm actually dead serious here. Are important and influential people as they are in my case, and that.
Okay, so then it does matter. Then it does matter whether people perceive you as an asshole BernieBro. And let me just, one specific example, by the way, and again, this wasn't just you that was being referred to, but the BernieBro issue, if you ask, why did Joe Biden do so well in South Carolina that the establishment that Klobuchar and Buttigieg threw in the towel and decided now was the time to make common cause with him, and the whole establishment rallied around him? I think a couple of things happened. One, he got that, Tom Clyburn endorsement in South Carolina, but also he had a Jim Clyburn. He had a pretty good debate, the debate right before then, and Bernie had a tough debate because everyone was ganging up on him, and although he could have been more agile maybe, but for whatever reason, it was a slightly tough night for him. And one of 2 or 3 themes they all ganged up on was the BernieBro thing. It was like they several different people and he'd deny it, and then somebody else would say, no, your followers are mean. So, these things have consequence.
Look, of course they do, because Twitter is in fact real life. And I take your point. I don't think that's the main. I think if it weren't Bernie Bros, it would be something else. I mean, the bottom line is they don't want a socialist, and the party is consolidating in a way that they would have in an earlier era. But I would also argue, look, Bernie, we'll find out in a few hours how he did tonight. But the fact that he's even gotten this far, the fact that it's even remotely conceivable, has been powered by a lot of aggressive online energy. And, that has radicalized a lot of people my age and younger, and in many cases gotten them to actually go out and organize, and phone bank, and do things like that. I think that there are dark sides to that. I mean, look, I have been harassed by Bernie Bros, if you want to look at it that way. Like, people who are hardcore for Bernie have told me that I'm a piece of shit. But I've also been harassed across the spectrum, which is why I find the whole line of attack very disingenuous and silly, because I can tell you from personal experience, every single political candidate and every single political cause has some followers who are just vicious assholes.
Absolutely.
And I would say to all of them, singled out for
what I would say to all of them, Bernie Bros or Warren whatever's.
Well, the worst are actually what are called the K-Hive, the Kamala Harris followers.
Okay, well, I would say to all of them, nuts. I would say to all of them, given my reading of the tactical dynamics, don't do a disservice to your candidate by making it easy for people to depict their followers as assholes. But so we should go. We should go. Say a final thing.
I really enjoyed this. We did go for an hour and 40 minutes, which is crazy.
We're reaching Joe Rogan territory. One of the warning signs.
Honestly, Bob, I think in the years I've known you now, I think this is actually the first time we've ever done one together, the two of us.
An actual dialogue, that's probably true.
Yeah. I mean, I've edited many that you hosted. I hosted many. I've done some with Ari.
When we say edited, by the way, we don't mean editing the video. We mean just breaking up the thing into titleable topics.
But I've done that. And, but this is, I think, this is for all that you are my boss. It was a first. Well, this must be the longest conversation we've ever had.
We made up for lost time.
Yeah.
With the
link. This was fun. I would go on again sometime. I see you shaking
Well, if
your
you
head.
behave yourself.
If I behave myself.
That's possible.
Although, I don't know. I got on here by not behaving myself.
Yeah,
Bob,
but we don't do reruns. There'll have to be a new phase in your spiritual development.
Well, we'll see. But anyway, I had a great time, and I do take your criticisms, seriously.
Good. And I take yours seriously.
Thank you, Bob.
Seriously, but not literally, or whatever it is.
Whatever.
Or literally. No, literally. I take them literally, but not seriously.
Let's go find out what happened on Super Tuesday.
Yeah, let's do that. And let's say,
as we say on Twitter, now to take a giant sip of coffee and check the exit polls out.
We should also say, as on Twitter, you can be found at David Klion, Klion, and I can be found at Robert Writer, Wrighter.
That's right.
And that's a fitting way to end. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Bob.